Go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Leggett and I'm from the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence in the Department of Communities. Thank you so much for joining us today for our monthly webinar. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from Boorloo on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that all of you are joining us from today. So this is one of a normal sequence of webinars hosted by the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence. And what we wanted to do today was take the opportunity to spend some time talking about the announcement on Friday from the government related to the Family and Domestic Violence Task Force. So we intended to talk you through the system reform plan that has been released, as well as the funding announcement. And I also will give you some brief updates on a couple of other procurement processes that are live at the moment. So really, I guess the scope of what we wanted to spend time on today was the announcement that was forthcoming on Friday. We will provide information to you today about the system reform plan and the associated funding. We will make this slide deck available to people after the fact of the webinar. If you have colleagues or if there's anybody who's not been able to make it today that would be keen to get access to this same information, but we'll also provide links to where the source documents are online so people can have access to that as well. So our normal format for a webinar is we usually spend about half an hour providing updates and presenting, if you like, and then take some time for question and answer. We will use that same type of format today. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat as we go. We will attend to them at the end of the webinar, as opposed to sort of trying to work through them as we go. If we don't or can't answer a question today, then we'll make sure that we come back to it and provide an answer out of session. I suppose in terms of the level of information that we'll be providing today, it will be reasonably high level and overview. Detailed questions about procurement approaches we won't be able to talk about today, mostly because we're still in the processes of settling and finalising, as well as the fact that some of the procurement processes are being led by other government agencies. So if there's particular areas or programs that you have an interest in, please feel free to signal them and we can plan our next webinars around making sure that we're attending to those issues and giving you updates as things develop and progress. So I guess without too much additional introduction, if I can get my team to move into the next slide, and I'll provide a bit of an update on the work of the task force. We might have a bit of a lag on the slides. Rach, can you get it to move across? While we're waiting for the slides to catch up, I'll just offer, I guess, a bit of background and context around the Family and Domestic Violence Task Force. As many of you would know, the task force was convened by the government in September, following crisis talks led by the sector and lived experience advocates, particularly the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing, Stopping Family Violence, and advocates that included Alison Scott. So the task force was a government response to the crisis talks and the key asks tabled by the sector and advocates at the crisis talks on the 31st of August. Sorry, Rachel, just get you to go. Yeah, you got it. The terms of reference for the task force were very clearly focused on system reform. So part of the key asks presented to government by at the crisis talks included a range of things, 19 things, 17 of them related to funding. One was about establishment of a lived experience advisory group, and one was about convening a task force to particularly focus on system reform and thinking about the ways that victim survivors access services are supported by services, and the way the very, I guess, complex existing system response to family and domestic violence works, and how it can be improved to deliver better outcomes for victim survivors and to have better visibility of, attention to, and responses to perpetrators. So the brief of the task force was very much focused on system reform, although they also had a role in advising government around responses to the key asks that related to sector funding. The other thing that happened in September when the government announced the task force was a commitment at the outset to establishing a lived experience advisory group. So I will touch on that as we go through this presentation as well. The task force was convened for a period of 6 months. They met roughly monthly between September and March and have now concluded their term. During that period of time, the task force, which was comprised of directors general across government and key sector leaders from peak and representative organisations, so the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing, Stopping Family Violence, WACOS, Noongar Family Safety and Wellbeing Council and Aboriginal Health Council WA, as well as we had Professor Chung on the task force representing the academic sector. So that group of people met monthly between September and March, as I said, essentially to inform what was released on Friday, being a system reform plan. Informing their work along the way was consultation into the sector. So there were 5 workshops around Aboriginal family safety, 4 system reform workshops, and a range of bilateral meetings with government as well as community sector stakeholders and representatives. Rach, can I get you to move across? So when the next slide comes up, what you will see is an image of one of the products that is currently available online, and it's essentially a one-page overview of the system reform plan. I'll just start speaking to it before the slides catch up, just acknowledging that there is a lag. When the task force was approaching the system reform work, part of the discussion that they had is essentially what were the priorities to attend to. So given the breadth and scope of potential system reform in this space, decisions were made early about what were the priority areas that we needed to attend to help build a foundation for a stronger response to family and domestic violence across the board, regardless of where victim survivors touched the service system or entered the service system. And fairly early in the piece, the decisions were made in the task force meeting about focusing on risk assessment and risk management, information sharing and workforce development. And they have in effect become the pillars to the system reform plan that I'm talking to you about today. The reason those 4 things have been prioritised is because they are so foundational to everything that happens in the sector, regardless of whether it's in government, community sector or Aboriginal community controlled organisations, in relation to how we are responding to family and domestic violence. And as you would all know, without good quality risk assessment, we don't have visibility to the range of issues that a victim survivor might be experiencing or the risk posed by a perpetrator. Without good processes for risk management, including mechanisms for coordinating case management when we have multiple services and agencies involved, we run the risk of creating gaps and silos in response that victim survivors can too easily fall through and that perpetrators can too easily hide in. We know that risk assessment and risk management most fundamentally needs to be supported by information sharing, because that's the way that we can generate that collaboration and connection that we need to be able to provide those joined up and coordinated responses. And that to support any professional in this space, there needs to be good rigour and good consistent approaches to workforce development and not just training. So thinking about the ways that we can develop and support workforces specific to professional and organisations' roles and responsibilities in this space to be able to equip them with the knowledge and skills that they need to perform the roles that we need them to in responses to family and domestic violence. So this one-pager is essentially just gives a very brief snapshot as to what the focus of the system reform plan is, which are those 4 pillars, which I've just briefly spoken to, which help aid in a vision which is a family and domestic violence response system that is collaborative, connected and organised around victim survivors' safety, recovery and re-establishment, where all parts of the system provide trauma-informed, culturally safe and joined-up services to keep victim survivors safe and hold perpetrators to account. So as you can see from this vision statement and in the summary descriptions I've just provided you around the pillars, the focus of this work is absolutely about how we work, almost beyond the component part. So one of the things that is in the system reform plan is a recognition that the critical foundation to this is a strong and supported specialist service sector. But the reform plan itself is not just about specialist services. It's not about community services. It's about the way everyone in this space, from government, community sector and Aboriginal community controlled organisations, works and fulfills a role around identifying and responding to family and domestic violence. So the next slide speaks to those 4 pillars that I've just spoken to. I will get Rachel to move the slide across. These are essentially the goals that we're working to in each of these 4 spaces. And I won't read it out because they're largely similar to what I've just spoken to in the introduction. But it's really, I guess, about reinforcing the absolute importance of each of these 4 pillars, as well as their interconnectedness, because delivering on any one without the others won't create the change that we're looking for in terms of improving victim survivor experiences of navigating the service system, as well as the outcomes and the impact that services can have when they're working together for victim survivors, including in the ways that they are responding to the perpetrator. Next one, Rachel. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time to talk through the reform actions that sit in relation to each of these 4 pillars. And then after that, we'll talk about the funding that was announced on Friday and how that relates to delivery of the reform plan. We'll also take a few minutes to talk about governance for delivery, because that was a big part of the discussion in the task force meetings as well, was not just about how we come up with the plan, but how we actually authorise the delivery and create accountabilities to the delivery. So in the system reform plan, the first pillar being around workforce development has 5 actions. And I guess the theme around all of these reform plan pillars is the actions kind of scaffold from setting a standard, resourcing delivery to the extent that that's relevant, and then thinking about ways that we can embed and require that practice shift that we're trying to create. So in the workforce development space, the first reform action is to develop a capability framework. So similar to frameworks that we see in Victoria, which is building from strength, and even in the Northern Territory, we're wanting to be really clear and specific about the role of every type of professional in this space, as I said, government, non-government, Aboriginal community controlled, what their role is, what their responsibilities are, and what those foundational knowledge and skills are that they need to deliver on their role. So that would be set out in a capability framework. We also have a reform action around having a dedicated entity, and the term entity is a bit vague here, but essentially reflecting that it would likely be a dedicated organisation that is focused on workforce development, and focused on workforce development on a continuum from direct training through to potentially quality assuring training products that are produced elsewhere, to taking and adapting training products that might be available from other jurisdictions, as well as thinking about the broader workforce strategies that we might need to be thinking about. So, for example, ways that we can create pathways into family violence response work, ways that we can scaffold learning in the sector or in government agencies. So the remit around this workforce entity is intended to be fairly broad in order to provide scope to think about a more strategic approach to how we are developing and preparing workforces to be best equipped to respond to family and domestic violence. The next 2 actions are really about embedding. So if we're setting a if we're setting a capability framework and we're providing resourcing around supporting workforce development, how do we reinforce and back that in the ways that we, I guess, can use and create levers that we have to hand, both within government and non-government and Aboriginal community controlled organisations. So thinking about the various ways that we can embed those workforce capabilities, including by establishing minimum training standards in organisations. The last action area, which was repeatedly raised and recognised through this space, was about our responsibilities as employers and how we are supporting our own staff if they're experiencing or using violence. So that came to be quite a recurring theme in the consultations and in the discussions that were had in the task force meetings, as well as in the community-based consultations that occurred outside. Around the information sharing area, again, some of these actions are about kind of setting standards, and other things are about embedding and creating architecture and infrastructure, if you like, to support information sharing. So the reform actions in this space include the first one being supporting better information sharing within existing legal frameworks. And I know that sounds like a bit of a nothing action. It's sort of about saying, are we doing the best with what we've got? And it's really just about recognising that some of our other information sharing work will take a little while to bring online. And while we are doing that development work to bring those things online, we need to be thinking about making sure that we've actually got the best practice that we can have currently with our current information sharing provisions. And to give you an example, and this is just one example, there are provisions in the Children and Community Services Act that enable and support information sharing in relation to family and domestic violence between government agencies and between government agencies and non-government organisations. So those provisions already exist, but we know that in practice, often what happens is the extent to which those provisions are used comes down to individual relationships as opposed to a more systematised practice. So this first action is intended to reflect, to start action on supporting practice to be more systematised within our existing legislative framework. Second action in this space is about supporting information sharing between specialist family and domestic violence services. And some of the particular thinking in this space is about how we can use SHIP and the Specialist Homelessness Services collection as a way to make sure that we're capturing good quality risk information and providing mechanisms to share that information between specialist services, particularly where we have a client who has come to a new service where we perhaps know that they've been at another service previously. So about thinking about the way that we can get best use out of that particular system. There's a reform action here about enabling data sharing between police, communities and justice. And this particular action is about recognising that this is just a starting point. And how do we take the administrative data that we already have between these agencies and use it in a way that helps us both target our work as well as to inform and provide opportunities around performance monitoring on our work. So the intention around this action isn't to stop once we've achieved data sharing between police, communities and justice, but just to build this as a first start and the foundation with an understanding and an idea that we then might be able to build it out to include other data sets. The fourth action here is about establishing a central information point, and this is one of those structural change actions that I mentioned earlier. So it is about looking to the model in Victoria and to a lesser extent the model in South Australia, which is the Multi-Agency Protection Service, and thinking about the way that we can centralise the collation of risk information so that we can make it easier for professionals in particular to gather the relevant risk information to inform their assessments, but also to know who else is involved with a family, being the victim survivor or the person using violence or the children, to support and facilitate that coordination of response. The last action area in this space is around considering a dedicated disclosure scheme for victim survivors. And again, this is a model that we see in South Australia and has previously been trialled in New South Wales. And it is about providing a way for people in the community who may have seen some red flags in their partner or may have experienced violence from their partner to have a point of contact where they can find out if their partner has a previous history of family and domestic violence, and that history being offences or potentially responses from the police. So the action in this space at this early stage is about design work around such a scheme. So it, at its most kind of, at this early point, would really be about thinking about how this could look in WA. In the pillar around risk assessment, there are 4 actions. The first one being creating a whole of system standard for identifying, assessing and managing risk. And this is really, I guess, about recognising that although we have a common risk assessment and risk management framework in WA, it's not doing what it was intended to do when it was first created many years ago. And many of you will have been involved in the review process over the last 6 months, but it's really about revisiting that framework, or a framework like that, for creating a clear and consistent standard of practice across everyone who's involved in responding to family and domestic violence around what they are required to do in respect of screening for family violence and the assessment, management and monitoring of risk. And recognising that not every professional has the same level of responsibility in respect of breadth of role across that whole continuum. We might have some professionals just involved in screening and referral, and then others that have a more kind of comprehensive role. But it's really about resetting the standard and resetting and embedding those requirements across the system. Separate to that, and something that was recognised as something to elevate as a standalone, is about looking at dedicated practice around assessing and responding to risk related to Aboriginal family violence. So it's a standalone action in the plan because of its importance, but it's not to say that the risk assessment work won't attend to the unique vulnerabilities and risks that occur in other sections of our community, particularly in relation to culturally and linguistically diverse people, people with disability, people from LGBTQIA+ community, and even the unique vulnerabilities for younger women, older women. It's so those things will be attended to and are named in the sort of bigger version plan document. The third action in this space is around embedding and requiring. So really, I guess, going back to the fact that if we're setting a new standard, what are the things that we're going to put in place, which would include consideration to legislation that is going to actually embed and require these practices in the long term. And then the fourth is about exploring alternative response pathways. And that's really about recognising that not every victim survivor and not every supporter of a victim survivor is going to call the police. So making sure that we've got adequate alternatives for people who are at risk of or who are experiencing violence, or people who are concerned about someone who is experiencing violence, that there's a way that they can come forward and express those concerns without needing to interact with the justice system if that is a barrier to them. Next one, please. And I think this is our last reform area. And this one is over 2 slides, and it's related to risk management. So the first area here is about authorising and embedding models for case coordination. And that language is very deliberate in the sense that we know that need for joined up and coordinated responses is so central and essential to our responses to family and domestic violence, not least of which is because victim survivors and the people using violence are often supported by different types of responses. So most fundamentally, just as a basic rule of thumb, to deal with the whole family, we've got multiple different organisations and systems involved, and we need to make sure that there's ways that those things are joined up and are working towards a shared and common goal and outcome to try and get the best impact and outcome out of our response system. The language around authorising is very intentional because it's intending to be about how do we get away from this being an opt-in practice? How do we get to a place where this is systematised and embedded and is the rule rather than the exception? The second action in this space is around investment in perpetrator responses, and importantly also to look at really planned approaches. So to delivering on the perpetrator response framework, which was in fact an action in the first action plan of Path to Safety, revisiting the standards of practice that we set in this place, about investing in evaluation and processes for continual improvement, as well as just investing in the sheer number of perpetrator responses that we have available in WA. The third action here is safe accommodation initiatives, and this one is framed very broadly, but it's really about recognising the absolute fundamental need for safe and affordable housing and accommodation for victim survivors of family and domestic violence in order to support pathways to safety. So the way the action is framed is quite broad, and it's framed broadly really to recognise that we need to think about this from a range of different avenues, including family violence provisions in the Residential Tenancies Act, including in the importance of crisis and transitional accommodation, including in the importance of pathways into public and private rental markets. I've just realised we've actually missed out a couple of actions from our risk management space. So I will carry on with the presentation as it's sequenced here, but when we send the slides around, I'll add that extra slide in, and we might just give a little bit of extra detail in that one in the same way I've just been speaking to the others, so that you've got that more fulsome and complete picture. So really, I guess, now I'm sort of stepping into the space around the funding that has been announced by the government, that has been informed by the task force. You would all be familiar that in November, the government announced a funding package of $72.6 million, and that on Friday, they announced an additional investment of $96.4 million. So in November, that funding was in the majority organised around funding for specialist services, although not exclusively, whereas a large part of the funding announced on Friday is really largely about system reform and how we get to a place of creating, I guess, those foundational changes to the way the whole collective service system works to respond to family and domestic violence. So I'm going to go through the particular initiatives that were announced and give you, I guess, a little bit of visibility to those, and then I'll pause and be happy to take questions. And also, as I said, there might be a lot of things that we can't give answers to today, but we will absolutely take a record of them. We'll endeavour to come back to you, or we'll sequence those questions and kind of interest areas into, you know, subsequent webinars that we host, to make sure that you keep getting good visibility, not only to the initiative, but also about how it intends to be rolled out. So of the funding that was announced, just over 50 million, so 53.8 million, relates in some way to the operation of the family and domestic violence response teams. And actually, this is the area of the risk management actions that we didn't have in the slide deck. So what is in the system reform plan related to risk management includes a range of actions around the family and domestic violence response teams. The first being about increasing their operation to 7 days per week, because we know that at least 30% of family violence incidents attended by the police occur on the weekend, and that for as long as I can remember, the response teams responding to victim survivors on Monday not only, I guess, face a backlog in those incidents, but we've got victim survivors sometimes that have experienced an assault and had an initial police response, almost 3 days prior before they're being offered follow-up support on the Monday. So really about fundamentally shifting the way those teams work to make sure that there is coverage every day of the year, weekends and public holidays. For quite a long time, there has been uncertain funding in this space around the non-government partner in the response teams, being the Coordinated Response Service. So this package of funding includes ongoing funding for coordinated response services at a higher and expanded at the higher level that they have had, though uncertainly, over the last couple of years. And it includes not only funding for their staffing, but also some specific supports around how they can operate as a kind of dedicated and standalone response. Also in this space is funding to a staged implementation of adult community corrections officers into the response teams, and that's building on a pilot that we've had in place for some time in Fremantle and the West Kimberley. And the last component part, which isn't on the slide, is some funding to bring forward the implementation of family safety officers, which are dedicated staff who are responsible for convening multi-agency case management for high-risk, high-harm cases of family and domestic violence. So originally, when we got that money to do that particular piece of work, it was intended to be phased in over a period of 3 years. Our first year implementation is past, and this money is about bringing everyone on board over the next 12 months. So instead of phasing in over 3 years, it's been contracted to 2. The funding package also provides $14.2 million for an additional one-stop hub in the Perth Central Business District to be located at the Rua Centre for Women and Children. There's $4.5 million over 4 years for to uplift the funding for the breathing space program in Callista and Maylands, and that's really about bringing those services back to an ability to offer the full kind of suite and spectrum of program as it was originally conceived and intended, and making that sort of program and their operations commensurate with the Headland breathing space, which was announced in November. There is $6.2 million over 4 years for the workforce entity or workforce organisation. If I can offer some explanation around that, there's 200,000 in 24-25, which is to do co-design work. So essentially an opportunity to work with stakeholders and partners across government, community sector, Aboriginal community controlled organisations to talk about how this entity and organisation will actually operate, what will be of the greatest strategic benefit to us, and then $2 million per year over 3 years for the operation, understanding that there will be a procurement process in between the design and commencement of operations. There's $4 million over 4 years to fund a safe house in Leonora, and also to expand our 2 existing rapid rehousing programs. And I'll just get Rachel to move over the page. Just while the slide's catching up, I will wait actually just so you can see the information on the slide as I'm speaking to it, because it's a lot of numbers and I appreciate that that can get very confusing. There we go. So there's $3.2 million for the Department of Justice to provide victim representation and support at prisoner review board meetings. There's, working down the page, $1.6 million, which is to commence the design work on the central information point. Part of that money is to do the work around the Specialist Homelessness Information Platform, so SHIP, that would enable better information sharing with specialist services. So that $1.6 million amount is very much about design and that preparatory work for moving towards a central information point. The middle top box is $3.1 million to boost capacity of existing family and domestic violence community-based counselling and advocacy services. And for the Department of Communities, the FDV CAS, or Counselling and Advocacy, is a particular service group. There's 23 services around the state, but they actually do a very wide spectrum of activities and they're funded at a very wide range. So this $3.1 million is to be over a period of 2 years, so $1.5 million a year, and it's specifically about addressing waiting lists and unmet demand. So it's intended to be procured through an expression of interest process. It's not a flat uplift on the service group. It's really about trying to address where we have very clearly demonstrated unmet demand and provide a boost in capacity to meet some of that unmet demand. There's $490,000 over a 2-year period to pilot a community-based short-stay intervention program for mothers and babies who are at risk of or are victim survivors of family and domestic violence. And this particular initiative will be led by the Department of Health. There's $1.9 million to establish the Lived Experience Advisory Group. So I might just take a moment to talk about this very briefly now. One of the things that the task force was responsible for doing was oversighting a design piece around the Lived Experience Advisory Group. We were very lucky to have Quab Up Consultancy and Alison Scott do a piece of community-based consultation and also design work for us, which included jurisdictional scan, working with a working group of the task force, looking at models of practice in other locations, including in other portfolio areas in WA, hearing from the voices of people with lived experience out in the community, and then coming back to the task force with suggestions about how we could establish such a group in WA. So the government has committed to establishment of the Lived Experience Group. They've allocated funding towards it, but they're just still in the process of considering and approving a model, which will be announced fairly soon, I would say. I shouldn't put a date on it, so it will be announced in the coming weeks. There is funding for the Department of Justice to start the consultation process around the disclosure scheme. And have we got another slide on this?
No, governance is the next one.
The Department of Justice also have some design funding for victim survivor advocates in the court system. So you will see, I guess, in the breadth of the funding, there's a mix between funding for things to get going right away and funding for design and preparatory work in order to inform full scope models and full scope costings, which then we'll take forward towards implementation. So I'm going to pause on the funding there and start talking about governance, because this is something that was discussed quite a lot throughout the task force in respect of how do we have accountability to delivery. So what has been approved, and part of the announcements made by the government, is that an implementation oversight committee will be established. It will have senior representation across government, as well as representation from community sector and Aboriginal community controlled organisations, and they will essentially have a role in oversighting, leading and driving the implementation of this reform plan. The, I guess, organising principles that sit with the governance are absolutely about a partnership approach, which includes co-design. So all of those initiatives that have funding for preparatory work, as well as initiatives that may not have funding attached that still need further scoping of work, those things will be done in partnership with community sector, with government and with Aboriginal community controlled organisations. The other thing that was heard quite strongly, both from the stakeholders that were engaged as well as in the task force itself, was around the importance of public accountabilities to delivery. So the government has agreed to twice yearly public reporting on implementation progress, which I actually think will be a very good and effective mechanism for supporting an ongoing momentum to the delivery of this reform plan. Do we have any more slides? So in respect of the governance and understanding, I suppose, that this announcement was made as a pre-budget announcement and just came out on Friday. So I don't have all the details yet on the governance. It's something that is being worked out. But by the time we come back to our next monthly webinar in May, I should be able to provide a lot more detail in that space. So we've got quite a few questions, 16 questions. So what we'll do is we'll work through as many as we can, and then anything that we don't get to, we will provide like a Q&A written response so everyone can see what the question was and what the answer is.
Do we have any thoughts on which entity will lead the information sharing work?
So the question is are there any thoughts on which entity will lead the information sharing work? So across those reform actions that relate to information sharing, there is differences about who is leading which parts. So as an example, the Department of Communities will have leadership of the work around the specialist homelessness services collection and any sort of reform or changes that occur in that space. The Central Information Point will have a leadership role through the Department of the Premier and Cabinet and their Office of Digital Government, because the early thinking is that there's might be a way that we can use the People WA dataset, which is a linked data asset across government, as part of the model for a Central Information Point.
Funding for upgraded case management software with the functionality that's needed to analyse and share data.
So the question is, will there be funding for upgraded case management software with the functionality that's needed to analyse and share data easily? I think the answer to that is yes and no. There's certainly some provisions for database upgrade, as well as some existing money that has been approved in previous budget processes, for example, for FBIR triage application, for the SafeNet system that supports the hubs, and in this particular package for the SHIP system, Specialist Homelessness Information Platform. So yes, there is money available. I think though probably what we need to test, and we're not entirely sure, is what's the scope of work and what can we achieve with the money we've got versus what might we need to seek additional funds for.
Why wasn't there any funding or commitment for Aboriginal healing services, commitments from the Aboriginal Family Safety Strategy?
So this question is, why wasn't there any funding or commitments for Aboriginal healing services or commitments from the Aboriginal Family Safety Strategy? It's an excellent question and something that we had attention to throughout the reform plan, including in relation to how each of the reform actions could be used or might have implications specifically related to Aboriginal people experiencing violence and Aboriginal communities and their healing and safety work more broadly. So a lot of the actions have specific annotations around what it might look like for an Aboriginal community controlled organisation or an Aboriginal led response around family violence. And I can also tell you, which I had intended to do at the top, that our Aboriginal Family Safety Grants Program, which is $6 million over 2 years, will be opening mid-May. It's grant monies that is specifically for Aboriginal community controlled organisations or Aboriginal registered businesses. There is a non-mandatory briefing on Thursday, which we will share information around after this webinar, so everybody's got that detail and information, but that will be opening soon.
What is a new organisation being established to support and develop family-based violence informed workforces? Is it a government organisation?
So this is about the workforce entity. So the question is about the timing and whether or not it'll be located in government. So the intention is that it would not be a government response, that it would be an independent organisation, independent from government at least. The design work will occur in 24-25 and then lead into a process of a competitive procurement. So it not getting ahead of the design process, it could look like all sorts of different things, I guess.
Did the government prioritise the program's issues for funding?
So in terms of how the government prioritised the programs and issues for funding, it was really, I guess, a culmination from the work of the task force, what we heard in the workshops with stakeholders, including from community sector, Aboriginal community controlled organisations and government organisations. And essentially those things then informed the reform plan, including a sequencing of priority around what were some of those really important foundational things that needed to happen first.
What is the term for the funding? 96.4 million, 35.
So the $96.4 million package is over a period of 4 years, but some of the initiatives are for a shorter period of time, particularly where it's just some initial funding has been given for design and an understanding that on the basis of that design that we would then go back to secure funding for implementation. So the package, although some of the things are over 4 years, some of them are just over a short period, like 12 months.
Why wasn't the refuge modelling funding included or prioritised? This was the work done 22-23 basis of what refuge needed right now to provide safe and support for sustainability.
Yeah. So this question is, why wasn't the refuge modelling funding, which was the commissioning work that was done in 22-23, which at that time did lead to a modest uplift for refuges and safe houses. So why wasn't that considered in the task force work? And I suppose probably the simple answer to that is because the focus really largely was on this system reform piece. And I think that probably what I should have said at the outset, and something that the Minister made a point of mentioning in her announcement on Friday, is this is the government's funding package that they've announced on Friday, but it's not the end or a full stop on our family violence work in this space. I think all of you would probably be aware that National Cabinet meeting tomorrow is going to be focused on family and domestic violence. Much like has been the case over the last couple of years, continued attention and continued advocacy in this space will continue to lead to new and different opportunities. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this is today's announcement. It doesn't mean that there won't be other things that are considered over time.
How has the department advocated at a Commonwealth level to increase refuge funding?
So the question is, has the department advocated at a Commonwealth level to increase refuge funding? The short answer to that question is yes, and most of you would know that our funding in this space is partly through tied agreement with the Commonwealth, where the Commonwealth provides part of the funding and the state provides another part. So yes, there is continual and ongoing advocacy in this space.
What is the turnaround time for decisions for prevention grants currently being tendered?
So this question is about the primary prevention grants, and another great prompt, because this was the other thing I wanted to flag at the top. So we currently have a grants round open on Tenders WA for primary prevention grants, and it is primary prevention of violence against women, but particularly focusing on family and domestic violence. They are open now. I believe they're closing on the 7th of May, but I'll just qualify and correct that statement if I get it wrong with advice that comes around after this webinar. And we'll be looking to turn that around very quickly, because we're very aware that we have some primary prevention programs that have and are ceasing at, well, possibly already ceased. Some of them have been extended, and to whatever extent's possible, we want to create continuity, at least in community, so that there's consistency of message and consistency of exposure to primary prevention work.
How is the department or office seeking input from the sector and lived experience on the progress of the state and national strategies?
So this is probably a question a little bit about governance. So as I talked about earlier, an implementation oversight group will be established. It'll have representation from government, community sector and Aboriginal community controlled organisations. The Lived Experience Advisory Group will be established, if you can imagine, alongside that. The Lived Experience Group will report directly to the Minister, but they will also have a role in informing the Implementation Oversight Committee. So as a basic governance structure, that is how it will look. Because of the program of reform work and quite a broad program of work. I imagine that will probably take the opportunity to form subject-specific working groups under that implementation oversight group. And in that process, again, it would be that sort of composition of government, non-government and Aboriginal community controlled organisations. How we manage that sort of movement of information in the middle will be important, but it will also be challenging. So we'll have to give some thought to that in those meetings, so that if we've got lots of different representatives across different organisations, that we are making sure that people have the information they need to come to the table to inform and guide decision making, but also understand the connectedness of the piece of work that they're involved in relation to the other system reform things that are happening.
So this is around family violence is often about physical violence, but there's often things that affect women's sense of safety is subtle. Yep, what funding is available for work in this area?
So this is a great question and it's quite long, so I'm not going to read it all out, but at its core, it's about what funding is available for improving work in the area of recognising coercion and control, and also about, you know, having particular attention to law enforcement and the courts. So in a way, this is topical and relevant for lots of different reasons. One of the smaller amounts of funding announced in the package on Friday was for sort of early planning implementation around the recommendations in the Commissioner for Victims of Crime Coercive Control report, or report about criminalising coercive control. So there will, and the government has already made commitments around that, which if there's particular interest in it, we could have Commissioner Katie Kraslin come along and speak to more specifically in one of these webinars. We also in November received first responder funding specifically for the legal and justice sector, and to include a specific focus on coercive control. So there's some very early scoping work happening now and will continue to occur over the next 6 months, and then that will lead into dedicated funding essentially around workforce development that is specific to legal and justice sector, around their ability to identify and respond to family and domestic violence, but particularly with a focus on coercive control. The 2-year community short stay will be continued if successful. So the comment is, can we have some assurance that the 2-year pilot of community-based short stay will be continued if successful? And I think this is referring to the Department of Health initiative around the mother and baby unit. I think it's probably, like, I can't genuinely make that assurance. I think what I can say is that the decisions that the government has made thus far creates this kind of rolling opportunity to be arguing for the funds that we need for system reform implementation. The structure of the governance will also help do that, particularly with the role of the Lived Experience Advisory Group reporting to the Minister. So I can't offer you a guarantee, but I think that this system reform plan has been approved by Cabinet. That was part of the precursor step to its announcement on Friday. And I feel like with the commitments already made, it is one of the best examples that I've seen in a long time of a government commitment to a plan of action and actually resourcing and mobilising delivery of that plan.
To go. Next question.
So the question is there sector representation on a committee advising or having input into the delivery of the state strategy? So perhaps if this is referring to Path to Safety, many of you would know that for a long time there was a steering committee established to oversight implementation of Path to Safety, and essentially it's been on a hiatus. A hiatus for a couple of reasons, but the predominant one being the convening of the task force. I think probably we will focus on getting this task force reform work underway in a really considered way, but in a way that really sets it up for success with the momentum that it needs to actually drive the implementation. And the focus of our efforts will be there first. But in having that implementation oversight committee, they will absolutely have a responsibility for thinking about alignment to Path to Safety and Aboriginal Family Safety Strategy. They will also have an opportunity to be thinking about alignment and advising around Commonwealth work, particularly around the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. So this new governance that will be stood up for this particular piece of work will have a clear and specific remit around the reform plan, but there will be clear I guess, contextual requirements about its relationship to our existing state strategies and the Commonwealth work as well. Okay, so we are just coming to really the end, and I think there's probably a fair few questions that we haven't gotten to, and more are being added as we go. So what I will say is the chat will remain open for quite actually, I might just check that with my team. The chat should remain open, and maybe does that work? Well, actually, perhaps the more fail-safe way to do this is we've taken a record of all of the questions that are in the chat now. There is a central inbox on your screen now. If you have a question that you haven't yet had an opportunity to post into the chat, please feel free to send it through to that email address. What we will do is anything that we haven't given an answer to, we'll prepare it in a Word document, we'll provide responses, and then we'll circulate that around with the slides from today's webinar so that we can make sure that everybody has had their question answered to the extent that it's possible to answer it today. I guess I just also wanted to note that we will continue to have these webinars on a monthly basis, and we'll use that as one of the ways that we provide updates in the progress of this implementation work. But if there are other ways you would prefer to receive communication, we're also very happy to receive feedback of that nature. So please let us know if there's a different or alternative way that you would rather have regular updates about this work. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it. You will hear from us soon with the slides and with answers to questions that we didn't get time to attend to in this webinar. Thank you very much.